My daughter was 8 years old. She had a juice box in one hand and a stuffed rabbit missing one ear in the other. We were at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, Gate B7, waiting for a connection back to Portland after visiting my sister in Scottsdale. She was not supposed to see anything that day. She was supposed to fall asleep on the plane and wake up home, but children do not follow the script you write for them. She pulled on my sleeve, just once, the way she does when something genuinely confuses her, and she pointed across a crowded terminal at a man standing near a Hudson News kiosk. She said, very quietly, without drama, without a single ounce of the weight she could not possibly have understood, "Mommy, that is Dad." I did not move. I did not breathe. The terminal kept going. Announcements, rolling luggage, a toddler crying 2 gates down. All of it just continued. Like the world had not just tilted sideways beneath my feet, because the man she was pointing at had been dead for 3 years. Or so I had believed. His name was Daniel Mercer. He had this laugh, loud and kind of uncontrolled, the kind that embarrasses you in movie theaters. He ate cereal for dinner at least twice a week. He cried at nature documentaries but never at funerals. He said it was because animals do not choose their suffering. People do. I loved that about him. I think. Or I loved the version of him I had constructed, which is not the same thing at all. I know that now. We met in 2009 at a grad school orientation at the University of Oregon in Eugene. I was getting my master's in social work. He was, supposedly, getting his MBA. He had this confidence about him that I mistook for certainty. I was 24 years old and I had never met a man who walked into a room like he had already decided how it was going to go. Looking back, I understand that quality differently now. We got married in 2012. Small ceremony in Bend, Oregon. My mother cried. His mother wore beige, which is a choice, and his father shook my hand like I was a business contact. I told myself, different family, different culture. That is fine. You cannot marry someone's family. You marry the person. We moved to Portland. We bought a house in the Selwood neighborhood, small, old, with a kitchen that smelled like the previous owners had fried onions every single day for 20 years. I loved it anyway. We repainted the walls a kind of dusty sage green. We planted a garden we barely maintained. We had our daughter, Lily, in 2014. Those first years were good. I think they were genuinely good. Or maybe I am just a person who is very skilled at remembering only the parts that fit the story I needed to believe. Daniel worked in commercial real estate. He had a partnership with a man named Greg Halston. They flipped distressed commercial properties in the Pacific Northwest. Warehouses, old retail spaces, that kind of thing. On paper, it looked like a legitimate, even successful operation. They had an office on NW 23rd Avenue. They took clients to dinner. Daniel drove a nice truck. What I did not know, what I would not fully understand for years, was that the business was built on debt, layers and layers of debt. Personal loans, business lines of credit, private investors Daniel had convinced with his confident walk and his certain smile. The business had not been profitable in at least 3 years before he died. Before he supposedly died. But I did not know any of that when I was planting tomatoes in the backyard and putting Lily down for her naps and thinking my life was the life I had actually built. Here is the thing about me that I need you to understand, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am a social worker. I spent my career helping people identify when they were in unhealthy dynamics. I sat across from women in crisis and I helped them name what was happening to them. I was trained for this. I had the vocabulary, the framework, the professional instincts. And I missed every single sign in my own house. That is not self-pity. That is the honest thing. The therapist cannot see her own blind spots. The social worker does not spot the manipulation happening at her own kitchen table. It does not make me stupid, but it does mean that whatever I say next, you should hear it knowing that I was not some naive woman who had no tools. I had every tool. I just never turned them on my own life. And that is probably the most important detail of this entire story. If you have ever looked back at something and thought, how did I not see that? I think you already understand where this story goes. Stories like this are more common than anyone wants to admit. That is exactly why I share them. If this one already has you paying attention, you might want to stay for the whole thing. The first sign, the first real one, came in the spring of 2017. Lily was 3. I had gone back to work part-time with a nonprofit in Northeast Portland. Daniel had started traveling more, 2 or 3 days a week, sometimes longer. He said it was deals in Seattle and Spokane, in Sacramento. He sent photos, a conference room here, a steak dinner with clients there. It was not the travel that bothered me. It was the way he came home from the travel. He would come through the front door and he would go very quiet. Not tired quiet. Not happy to be home quiet. Something else. The way a person goes quiet when they are managing something invisible, like they are carrying a calculation in their head that they cannot put down. I asked him about it once. He said he was stressed about a deal that was taking longer than expected. He named a property, a warehouse in Tacoma. He was specific. Specific enough that I did not push. I should have pushed. That fall, our joint credit card was declined at a grocery store on Hawthorne Boulevard. It was a Tuesday. I had a cart full of ordinary things, produce, pasta, a six-pack of yogurt cups for Lily's lunches. The cashier was kind about it, said it happened all the time. I paid with a card from my own personal account, and I stood in the parking lot afterward, and I thought, we have not been spending that much. When I told Daniel, he had an explanation ready in under 30 seconds. A bank processing error. He would call first thing in the morning. He was sorry I had to deal with that is embarrassing, he would get it sorted. The card worked fine 2 days later. But something in the back of my mind had been disturbed. Like when you walk into a room and you cannot quite identify what is different. A picture slightly tilted. A window left open. Nothing you can name. Just a change in the air. I started paying attention to small things. The way Daniel would sometimes angle his laptop away from me when I walked into the kitchen. The way he always took his phone with him when he went to the bathroom. These were not dramatic red flags. They were tiny, quiet deviations from a person I thought I knew. And every time I felt that instinct sharpen, he would do something to blur it. A weekend trip to the coast. A Sunday where he took Lily to Powell's Books for 3 hours so I could have the house to myself. A dinner he cooked from scratch. Lamb chops, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine he had been saving. He was attentive and funny and present. And I would feel the alarm in me quiet down, and I would think, I am imagining things. I am looking for problems. I have a good life. I should not be the kind of person who invents chaos. That, I have come to understand, was not accidental. The moments of warmth were not affection. They were management. Every time I got too close to something real, he recalibrated me. In early 2018, Daniel sat me down at the kitchen table, the one we had bought at a salvage shop in North Portland, the one with the scratch in the corner from when we moved it in, and he told me that his business was going through a rough patch. He said the commercial real estate market had softened. He said Greg and he were restructuring. He said he needed to pull some money from our savings to keep things liquid. He was calm. He had a plan. He had a timeline, 6 months, maybe 8, and then the deals they had in the pipeline would close and everything would normalize. I asked him how much. He said $40,000. That was almost all of what we had saved in 7 years of marriage. I sat with that number. I looked at the scratch on the corner of the table. I thought about Lily asleep in the next room. I thought about the sage green walls and the garden and the way he had cried at a documentary about elephants just 3 weeks before. I said yes. I said yes because I believed him. And because I was tired of being the suspicious one. And because saying no to your husband when he is sitting across from you looking scared, or performing scared, and you cannot tell the difference, is one of the hardest things in the world to do when you have built a life with that person. Be honest. What would you have done? The $40,000 left our account on a Thursday morning in March. The 6 months he had promised stretched to 8. Then 10. Then I stopped counting. By the summer of 2018, Daniel had taken out a life insurance policy. He told me it was something he should have done years ago. He told me it was responsible. We had a daughter. We had a mortgage. It was the right thing to do. He sat me down and walked me through the documents and had me sign as the beneficiary. The policy was for $340,000. I remember thinking, that is a lot. And then thinking, of course it is a lot. That is the point of life insurance. And then thinking nothing more about it at all. Because Lily had spilled something in the living room, and the moment passed. The moment passed. I wish I could go back and stay in that moment. Not to stop what was coming, I do not know if I could have. But just to look at it. To look at a man handing you a document and understand that it is not a form of protection. It is an exit strategy. February 4th, 2019. That date is in me like a splinter that never came out. Daniel told me he was driving down to Medford for 2 days to look at a property. He kissed Lily on the top of her head. She was watching something on her tablet and she barely looked up. He kissed me on the cheek. He grabbed his overnight bag, the green canvas one he had owned since before we met, and he walked out the front door. I watched him back out of the driveway. I remember the specific gray of that morning. Not dramatic storm gray, just the flat, ordinary gray of a Pacific Northwest winter. The kind of sky that makes everything feel slightly muffled. He texted me that afternoon. A traffic update. An observation about a diner he stopped at outside of Salem. Normal. Nothing. Then, nothing. By the evening of day 2, he had not called. He had not responded to my texts. I told myself, he is in a meeting, he is tired, he fell asleep early. I told myself 17 different versions of a normal explanation. By the morning of day 3, I called Greg Halston. Greg said Daniel had never shown up to Medford. I filed a missing person report with Portland Police on February 7th, 2019. 3 days after he walked out my front door. On February 11th, 7 days after he left, a hiker found his truck parked at a trailhead near the Rogue River in southern Oregon. The door was unlocked. His wallet was inside. His phone was inside, battery dead. His jacket, the heavy Carhartt one he wore all winter, was left on the passenger seat. No body was ever recovered. The Rogue River in February runs fast and cold. The investigators told me that recovery was, they used the word unlikely. They were kind about it. They sat across from me in my living room with the sage green walls, and they were genuinely kind. Over the following weeks, the picture that emerged was one of a man in crisis. Deep in debt, far deeper than he'd ever let me see. The business was not just struggling, it was built on a structure of lies told to investors who were now, themselves, looking for answers. Greg Halston, it turned out, had not known the full picture either. Or so he said. That part I still do not know completely. The official narrative that formed was, a man overwhelmed by financial collapse who drove to a river and made a final desperate choice. That was the story everyone believed. Including me. I grieved. I grieved in the ugly, disorganized way that grief actually looks. Not like a movie, not like a sequence of emotional stages. I forgot to eat and then I ate too much. I cried in the car where Lily could not hear me. I stood in the shower until the water went cold. I sat with my mother on the couch for 3 days and we did not say very much at all. I planned a memorial service. 60 people came. Daniel's mother wore black this time. 5 months later, after the legal process of a presumptive death determination in Oregon, the insurance company paid out $340,000. I was 33 years old. I was a widow, or I believed I was a widow, with a 4-year-old daughter and a mortgage and a grief I did not know what to do with. The money felt like a terrible gift. Like something you did not ask for and cannot return. I paid off the mortgage. I set aside a college fund for Lily. I kept the rest in savings and I tried very hard to build something that resembled forward motion. And for 3 years I did. Slowly, the way you do when something enormous has happened and you just have to keep going because the only other option is not going, and you have a child depending on you to go. For 3 years I believed Daniel was dead. And then a little girl with a stuffed rabbit pointed across a crowded airport terminal. And the 3 years dissolved like they had never existed at all. I need to take you back to that terminal. Because I rushed past it at the beginning of this, and you need to feel how long those seconds actually were. Gate B7. Phoenix Sky Harbor. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October 2022. The terminal had that specific airport energy, the low-grade anxiety of people checking departure boards, the smell of chain restaurant food mixing with recycled air, the particular exhaustion of fluorescent lighting on tired faces. Lily had been walking ahead of me. She does that. Even at 8, she had this confidence about moving through spaces, like she was always slightly more ready than the adults around her. I had our 2 carry-ons and my coffee and I was watching the gate number and half listening to an announcement about a delayed flight to Dallas. She stopped. That is what I noticed first. Not the direction she was looking, but the fact that she stopped walking. Lily does not stop. She decelerates or redirects, but she does not just stop. So I stopped too. On instinct. The way you do when you are a parent and something shifts in the body language of your child. And then, she pulled my sleeve. One pull. Quiet. Mommy. That is Dad. I looked where she was pointing. A man. Medium height. Dark hair, shorter than Daniel had worn it. He was wearing a gray Henley and dark jeans, and he had a black duffel bag over one shoulder. He was standing at the Hudson News kiosk looking at a rack of magazines. Relaxed, unhurried. The posture of someone who had nowhere to be except where he already was. And I felt. I do not have a clean word for it. It was not recognition and it was not shock. It was something slower and more nauseating, like the ground under me had shifted one quiet inch and I was the only one who noticed. Because from behind, from that angle, from 40 feet away, he looked exactly like Daniel Mercer. I told myself, it is not him. Of course it is not him. Millions of men have dark hair and medium builds and gray Henleys. You are a woman who lost her husband 3 years ago and you are looking at a stranger and your grief is playing tricks on you and you need to get to your gate. I told myself all of that in approximately 1.5 seconds. And then the man turned. He turned to reach for a different magazine on the rack. Just a slight angle, not fully facing me. Not a full profile. Maybe 30 degrees of rotation. Enough to see the line of his jaw. The way his ear sat against his head. A small, specific thing. A scar, barely visible, at the edge of his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident he had told me about on our 3rd date. The coffee cup in my hand was paper. I remember thinking very clearly, do not crush this cup. Hold the cup. Do not drop the cup. Because if I held the cup, I was still standing. If I was still standing, I was still a person who was functioning and not a person who was coming apart in an airport terminal in Arizona. Lily was still looking at him. Her juice box was at her side. Her rabbit was tucked under her arm. She said, a little louder this time, with the matter-of-fact certainty that only a child has. Mommy. That is Daddy. Why is Daddy here? I put my hand on her shoulder and I said, very quietly, very steadily, let us just find our gate. Okay, sweetheart? And I turned us around and I walked us in the opposite direction. I walked us to a row of seats near a window overlooking the tarmac, and I sat us down and I took out Lily's tablet and I put on the show she had been watching. And I placed my coffee cup on the armrest with both hands because if I let go of it I was not sure what my hands would do. Then I pulled out my phone. And I did the only thing I could think to do. I pulled up the photos I still had of Daniel. I had kept some, not many, and not displayed anywhere in the house, but kept. In a folder I had labeled with nothing, just a date. I looked at one. A photo from a camping trip we had taken in 2016 near Crater Lake. He was laughing at something off camera. The scar at the edge of his left eyebrow was visible. I sat with that photo for a long time. Then I stood up, told Lily I would be right back, and I walked, slowly, calmly, like a woman who was going to get another coffee, back toward the Hudson News kiosk. He was gone. I walked the length of the terminal. I checked the men's room corridor. I checked the gate areas on both sides. I looked at every dark-haired man of medium height for the next 20 minutes until our boarding group was called and I had to go. I boarded the plane. I buckled Lily in. I stared at the tray table in front of me for 3 hours and 20 minutes and I said absolutely nothing to anyone. But something had locked into place inside me. Something cold and focused and completely without sentiment. By the time we landed in Portland, I had already decided what I was going to do. Here is what most people do not understand about what comes next. They expect it to be dramatic. They expect rage, or a phone call to the police, or a confrontation. They expect the emotion to drive the action. But that is not what happened, because I had spent 8 years as a social worker doing intake assessments on some of the most complicated human situations imaginable. And I understood on some bone-deep professional level that the worst thing I could do right now was act on feeling. Feeling gets you dismissed. Feeling gets you labeled as a grieving widow having a breakdown. Feeling gets you a sympathetic detective and no actual outcome. Evidence gets you a case. So I went quiet. I told no one. Not my mother. Not my sister. Not my closest friend. I told Lily that sometimes people look like other people, and that was probably just a man who reminded us of Daddy. She accepted this the way children accept things they are not sure about. Not fully, but enough to move on. And then I started working. The first thing I did was go back through every financial document I could find from the last 2 years of our marriage. I had kept everything. Not out of suspicion, just out of habit. Box files in my home office closet. Bank statements, business documents, tax returns. I had touched almost none of them after Daniel's death because I had paid an accountant to help me sort through the estate. Now, I read everything myself. What I found, slowly and without drama over approximately 3 weeks of evening reading after Lily was in bed, was a financial architecture I had not known existed. Daniel had opened 3 accounts I had never known about. 2 business accounts and 1 personal savings account, all in the 18 months before his disappearance. The business accounts were connected to an LLC I had never heard of. Not the partnership with Greg Halston. Something else. A company called Meridian Westbrook LLC, registered in Nevada. Nevada. because Nevada has specific privacy protections for business registration that Oregon does not. I looked up Meridian Westbrook LLC. It had been registered in the spring of 2018. The same spring he took out the life insurance policy. I sat with that for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. There was a cup of tea on the desk that had gone cold 45 minutes ago, and I thought, he was not in crisis. He was not a man who snapped under financial pressure and made a desperate final decision at a river. He was an architect. He had been building the exit for at least a year before he used it. That realization did not make me cry. I had done my crying 3 years of it in 100 different rooms. What it made me was precise. I needed more. A financial paper trail alone was not going to be enough to prove a man was alive. The life insurance company had conducted their own investigation before paying out. Whatever I brought to them, or to law enforcement, had to be concrete, specific, verifiable. I needed to find Daniel Mercer. Have you ever trusted someone completely, given them full access to your life, and then realized the access was never mutual? I really want to know, because I think that experience is far more common than we admit. If this is hitting something real for you, there is more where this came from. I hired a private investigator in November 2022, 3 weeks after the airport. Her name was Vanessa Ortiz, and she worked out of a small office in Southeast Portland. She had spent 12 years doing insurance fraud investigation before going private. I chose her specifically for that background. I told her everything. The airport, the scar, the LLC, the timing of the insurance policy. I put every document I had on her desk in a manila folder, and I watched her read through them without expression, and I thought, this is either the action of a rational person or the action of someone who is losing it. I genuinely could not tell which. Vanessa could. She looked up from the documents and said, this is not grief talking. This is a pattern. And she told me that staged disappearances, what investigators call pseudocide, are more common than most people realize. She said the Rogue River location had been a very deliberate choice. Moving water. No body. A wallet left behind to confirm identity. A coat left on the seat to suggest someone who had stepped out into the cold. She said, the detail about the coat always bothered me about staged drownings. No one who actually intends to go into the water leaves their coat on the seat. They either take it off at the edge, or they go in wearing it. The coat on the seat is for the person who finds the truck. I had never thought about the coat. I had grieved the coat. I had looked at that coat in the police report and thought about the last time I had seen him wearing it, and I had felt something break in me. And the coat was a prop. Vanessa started with the LLC. Meridian Westbrook had no active business filings after the spring of 2019, 4 months after Daniel's disappearance. But it had made 2 wire transfers in that window, one to an account in Texas, one to an account in Mexico. Texas. She pulled flight records. You can do this legally through certain civil investigative processes, and found a cash purchase of a one-way bus ticket from Medford, Oregon to Sacramento, California, February 6th, 2019. 2 days after Daniel left our house. The name on the ticket was a Derek Morse. A name I had never heard, but the billing address attached to the Derek Morse ID, a prepaid card, purchased at a Walgreens in Salem, Oregon, was a P.O. box in Salem that had been opened 3 months earlier. In October 2018, when Daniel was traveling for deals. The pieces were not dramatic. They did not arrive in a rush of revelation. They came the way evidence always comes, slowly, tediously, with long gaps between them. There was a week where Vanessa had nothing new. 2 weeks where every lead went cold. A Tuesday evening where I sat in my home office and genuinely asked myself, what if you are wrong? What if you saw a man who looked like your dead husband and you have spent 2 months and $4,000 chasing a ghost? I thought about that seriously. I gave it real space, and then I thought about the coat on the seat. And I kept going. In December 2022, Vanessa located a Daniel Mark, note the last name, just 1 letter different, living in Austin, Texas. He had a rental apartment in the Mueller neighborhood. He was listed as a property consultant for a small real estate firm. He drove a dark blue pickup truck. He had a Texas driver's license issued in March 2019, 1 month after he disappeared. She sent me a photograph taken from across the street outside his office building. A man walking to a truck, gray Henley. Dark hair, slightly shorter than I had known it. The angle was 3/4 profile. I looked at that photograph for a very long time. Then I called Vanessa, and I said, that is my husband. And she said, I know, now we need someone else to confirm it officially. The next step was the one that required the most discipline. Because what I wanted to do, what every instinct was screaming at me to do, was call Daniel, get his number somehow and call him, or drive to Austin, or send him a message from a fake account just to see what he would say. I wanted to know. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to ask him, why? Vanessa told me very clearly, do not do any of those things. The moment he knows he has been found, he moves. He has already demonstrated that he is capable of building a new identity and disappearing. If he runs again, we lose him. So I did not call him. I did not drive to Austin. I sat in Portland in the dead of December and I did not do the thing I wanted to do. That was the hardest part of the whole thing. Not the grief, not the discovery, the restraint. Vanessa had a contact at the FBI, a former colleague who now worked financial crimes. She presented our evidence package, the LLC, the wire transfers, the false identity documents, the timing of the insurance policy, the photograph, the geographic trail from Medford to Sacramento to Austin. She framed it correctly, not as a domestic dispute or a missing person update, but as federal insurance fraud. Because that is what it was. $340,000 paid out on a fraudulent death claim is a federal offense. Full stop. The FBI opened a preliminary inquiry in January 2023. They moved quietly. They did their own surveillance. They pulled his financial records under federal subpoena, something Vanessa could not do. They found what she had found, and then they found more. They found that Daniel, operating as Derek Morse and later as Daniel Mark, had accessed the Meridian Westbrook LLC funds from accounts in Texas. They found that he had been living for 3 years on a combination of those funds and his salary at the Austin real estate firm. They found that he had a girlfriend. I do not know what to do with that information emotionally, and I never fully have. I have tried to approach it practically. Of course he had a life. That was the whole point. He built a new life, and a new life requires people. But there is something about imagining him, on a Tuesday evening maybe, making dinner in a Mueller apartment, living something that looked from the outside like a normal life, that does not sit still in me even now. He was alive. He was fine. He was, by all appearances, doing exactly what he had always done, performing the version of himself that the current situation required. And Lily had spent 3 years believing her father was dead. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Not the money, not the fraud, not even the years of my own grief. Lily, who at 4 years old sat through a memorial service where 60 people came to mourn a man who was alive and choosing not to be her father. That is the part that does not have a clean ending. The FBI made contact with Daniel Mercer, Daniel Mark, on the morning of March 7th, 2023. A Tuesday, at his apartment in Austin before he left for work. Vanessa told me afterward that he did not run. He did not make a scene. He opened the door, looked at the federal agents standing on his doorstep, and said, I figured this would happen eventually. That sentence has lived in me since she told me. I figured this would happen eventually. Not. I do not know what you are talking about. Not. There has been a mistake. He had always known he would be found. He had simply calculated that the years of freedom were worth the eventual cost. That is the most honest thing I think he ever said. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who is in the middle of something that does not feel right, who is doubting their own instincts because the person across from them keeps telling them they are imagining it, send this to them. Sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing you are not the only one who missed the signs until it was almost too late. When the FBI arrested Daniel Mercer on March 7, 2023, the charges were federal. Wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, false statements to a federal agency. The act of faking your death to collect insurance in the United States is not a single crime, it is a cascade of them. Because every step in the process requires a lie told to some institution that falls under federal jurisdiction. His lawyer, a man named Howard Brill out of Austin, entered a not guilty plea. I read that in a news alert on my phone at 7:14 in the morning while standing in my kitchen in Portland making Lily's lunch. I put the phone face down on the counter and I finished making the sandwich. Turkey and Swiss on whole wheat. Cut diagonally, which is how she likes it. I put it in her lunchbox next to an apple and a packet of crackers. Then I picked up the phone and read it again. Not guilty. I want to explain what those 2 words feel like when you have spent 4 months doing the work that I did, when you have sat in a private investigator's office with a manila folder, when you have handed a federal agent a paper trail and watched them nod slowly the way people nod when they already know something is going to matter. When you have held yourself together for 16 months past the moment your daughter pointed at a man in an airport. Because this started before the arrest. It started that October afternoon. Not guilty feels like being told the thing you experienced did not happen. I know that is the legal process. I am not naive about how it works, but understanding something procedurally does not make it emotionally neutral. His lawyer's strategy, as it emerged over the following weeks through filings and pretrial motions, was to argue that Daniel had been in genuine psychological crisis, that the decision to stage his death was the act of a man in a dissociative mental state, not a calculated fraud, that he had not intended to permanently deceive anyone, that he had been overwhelmed, had made a desperate choice, and had been too afraid to come back. 3 years. In Austin. With a new name. With a job. With a girlfriend. With a daughter who thought he was dead. The mental health defense in fraud cases is not unheard of. It requires expert testimony, and it requires the jury to accept a version of events that is, on its face, extremely difficult to square with the evidence of sustained, deliberate deception. An LLC registered a year before the disappearance is not the act of a dissociative mind. A prepaid card purchased at a Walgreens in Salem under a false name 3 months before you vanish is not the act of a man who snapped. It is the act of a man who planned. The prosecution made exactly that argument. And they had our evidence. Vanessa's investigation laid out in clean, documented sequence to support it. The trial began in September 2023 in Federal District Court in Austin, Texas. I flew down for the first week in the closing arguments. I did not testify. There was no reason for me to testify, because the case was built on financial and documentary evidence, not on my account of an airport moment. Which was probably better for everyone. I do not know what I would have said on a witness stand. I know what I felt. I am less certain what would have come out of my mouth. I sat in the gallery. I watched Howard Brill try to sell the jury a version of Daniel Mercer that was broken, frightened, and remorseful. Daniel sat at the defense table in a dark suit, and he looked appropriate, measured, genuinely sorry in the way that people look genuinely sorry when they are trying very hard to look genuinely sorry. I watched the jury watch him. I thought, you have met this man before. You just do not know it yet. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I was back in Portland for the deliberations. I had Lily in school. I had work. I had a life that did not stop for a federal jury in Texas doing its job. I checked my phone with a frequency I am not proud of. I cleaned the house. I reorganized a closet that did not need reorganizing. I made a soup from scratch that took 3 hours and tasted like nothing, because I could not concentrate enough to season it properly. On the afternoon of the second day, my phone rang. It was the federal prosecutor's office. Guilty. On all counts. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, I was not overcome. It was more that my legs simply decided they had been standing long enough and the floor was right there. I sat on the tile with my back against the cabinet under the sink, and I held the phone in both hands and I looked at the refrigerator across the room. It hummed. The same refrigerator from the old life. The one that had been humming in the background of every moment. The good moments, the confused moments, the $40,000 conversation at the salvage table, the morning he left with the green canvas bag. It had been humming through all of it. I thought, I have been in this kitchen for so many different versions of my life. Daniel Mercer was sentenced in January 2024. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Reyes, sentenced him to 7 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to make full restitution of the $340,000 to the insurance company, plus interest and investigative costs. Civil proceedings from the original investors in his Portland business, the ones he had defrauded before he ever staged his death, were still ongoing at the time of sentencing. Howard Brill said his client intended to appeal. The appeal was filed. As of the time I am telling you this, it has not succeeded. The insurance company recovered most of their payout. They were professionally and appropriately grateful for the documentation Vanessa and I had provided. They sent a letter. It was formal and correct, and acknowledged nothing of what it had actually cost to produce that documentation. The evenings, the money, the sustained suppression of the part of me that wanted to fall apart, and could not afford to. I kept the letter anyway. In the same box as the financial records. Some things you just hold on to because throwing them away feels like pretending they did not happen. I have not talked about Lily enough, and I need to. Because she is the part of this that I do not have clean answers for, and I think that matters more than the verdict. When Daniel was arrested, Lily was 8 years old. She had lived 4 years of her conscious life believing her father was dead. She had processed it in the way children process enormous losses. Not all at once. not linearly, but in waves. A question about heaven when she was 5. A drawing she made at school when she was 6 that the teacher sent home with a note because it depicted a man in a river. A period at 7 where she refused to talk about him at all. A period at 8, just months before the airport, where she asked me to tell her about him more. What was he like? What did he laugh at? What was his favorite food? I had answered all of those questions as honestly as I could without giving her more than she was ready for. After the airport, I told her as simply as I could that Daddy was actually alive, that he had been somewhere else, and that the people whose job it was to make sure everyone followed the rules were going to talk to him. I used the language of a child psychologist I brought in specifically for this. A woman named Dr. Angela Reyes in Northwest Portland, who specializes in childhood trauma and family disruption. Dr. Reyes told me that Lily would need to re-grieve, that the news that a parent is alive is not simply good news when the child has already done the work of accepting a death. It reopens the wound. It introduces a new, more complicated grief, not for a death, but for a choice. For a father who chose to leave. That distinction between a death and a choice is something Lily will spend years understanding. She is 9 now. She is funny and precise and still carries that stuffed rabbit with the missing ear. She asked me once, very directly, the way she does everything, did Daddy not want to be my dad anymore? I sat with that question for a very long time before I answered. I said, I think Daddy was in a lot of trouble, and he made a bad choice about how to get out of it. And that bad choice hurt a lot of people, including you. And none of that had anything to do with whether you are worth loving. Because you are. You are the most worth-loving person I have ever known. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, okay, and she went back to what she was doing. Children are not simpler than adults. They are just more efficient at moving through things they cannot change. I envy that. I am still learning it. She has not asked to see him. I have not pushed that in either direction. Dr. Reyes says that when Lily is ready, and if she is ever ready, the process of contact can be navigated carefully and on Lily's terms. Not mine, not Daniel's, Lily's. That is the only part of this I feel genuinely at peace about. Everything else is still in motion. But the decision about what Lily does with her father belongs entirely to Lily. That feels right. That is the one thing in 4 years that feels completely, unambiguously right. I do not share this story because it is dramatic. I share it because it is real. And because real stories, the ones without clean endings and obvious villains, are the ones that actually help people think through their own lives. If something in what Lily asked me resonated with you, or if you have ever had to explain an adult failure to a child, I would genuinely like to know how you handled it. Tell me in the comments, I read them. And if this kind of storytelling is something you want more of, you know what to do. I want to tell you what I actually think about Daniel. Not what I felt in the early days of shock and fury. Not the clean narrative of wronged wife and fraudulent husband. What I actually think now, with 4 years of distance and a therapy practice of my own and whatever wisdom I have managed to accumulate through this. I think Daniel Mercer was a man who was genuinely terrified. I think the financial collapse he had built and hidden was enormous, and he could not see a way through it that preserved the version of himself he needed to be. I think the thought of sitting across from me, from his wife, from the woman who had a master's in social work and an eye for dysfunction, and admitting the full truth of what he had done to our finances was something he could not make himself do. I think the exit he chose was not really about freedom. It was about shame. About the unbearable weight of being fully known by someone and found inadequate. That does not excuse it. I want to be very clear. Understanding a thing is not the same as forgiving it. And forgiving it is not the same as accepting it. What he did to me, what he did to Lily, what he did to the investors who trusted him, those things were wrong. They were chosen. They caused real damage to real people. But I am a social worker. I cannot turn off the part of my brain that asks, what made this person? Because if I turn off that question for Daniel, I have to turn it off for every person I have ever sat across from in a professional capacity. And I am not willing to do that. What I am left with is this. I am 38 years old. I live in the same house in Selwood with the sage green walls, which I have never repainted because I like them. The garden is better now than it ever was when Daniel lived here. I have had more time and more investment in it. I grow tomatoes and a truly excessive amount of basil and a rosemary bush that has gotten out of hand in a way I find very satisfying. I have a job I believe in. I have a daughter who is 9 and efficient and still carries a rabbit with a missing ear. I have a mother who calls every Sunday and a sister in Scottsdale who I now visit twice a year because the trip to Phoenix no longer carries the weight it once did. I have changed the airport I fly into, though. I fly into Sky Harbor still, but I take a different terminal. Small adjustments. That is how you rebuild. Not in grand gestures, but in small, specific adjustments to the life you already had. The question I get asked most when people know this story, the few who do, is whether I feel victorious. Whether the verdict felt like justice. And the honest answer is, it felt like something. It felt like the correct outcome of a process that was designed to produce correct outcomes. It felt like the evidence was taken seriously and the law was applied and the result was proportionate. That is not victory. Victory implies that something was won. But this was not a competition I chose to enter. It was a situation I discovered myself inside of, and I navigated it as well as I could with the tools I had. What it actually felt like, and this is the part I have trouble saying cleanly, was a kind of closing. Not a full close. Not a locked door. More like a window being brought mostly shut. You can still feel the air moving through the gap. But the draft is no longer knocking things off the shelves. There is one more thing, and I want to end on it because it is the thing that has changed me most. When I sat in that federal courtroom in Austin in September 2023, watching Daniel at the defense table in his dark suit, I realized something I had not expected to realize. I was not looking at a monster. I was looking at a man who had been so convinced that his own survival required other people's destruction that he had committed to that belief completely. A man whose catastrophic flaw was not cruelty, it was the absolute refusal to be honest about his own limitations. He could not say, I failed. He could not say, I need help. He could not sit in the discomfort of being seen as someone who had gotten things wrong. So he disappeared instead. And I thought, that is the most human thing about all of this. Not the fraud, not the money, the terror of being fully known and still loved anyway, and the choice to run from it rather than risk it. I spent years being angry at Daniel for leaving. I spent less time being grateful that he did. Because in leaving, he gave me something he never would have given me on purpose. A life that was entirely, unambiguously mine. This house. This garden. This daughter who is mine in a way she was always mine, but that feels different now. More solid, more settled, more certain. He ran from a life that I stayed for. And it turns out, staying was the better choice. I do not know if that is wisdom or just the story I tell myself to make the ending livable. But I am telling it anyway. Because it is the truest version I have. I want to ask you one final thing before you go. Not about Daniel. Not about the verdict or the money or the fraud. About you. Have you ever stayed in something? A relationship. A family dynamic. A situation. Longer than you should have. Because leaving felt like admitting that the thing you believed in was not real? I think most people have. I think that experience is one of the most quietly painful things a person can carry. If this story reached something in you, if it named something you have been trying to find words for, I would really like you to tell me. In the comments. Just a sentence or two. You do not have to explain the whole thing. Just, I know this feeling. That is enough. That is more than enough. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your kids. And trust the feeling that something is not right. Because it is almost always right.